areas of China's history and the China trade that never seems to get much attention, and I don't know why. I mean, there have been videos and people have talked about it a little bit, but the massivity of this trade, the size of it, and how long it lasted, and how little it gets discussed compared to the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company and the French India Company and all that. How this gets treated just is really strange to me. And it's called the Spanish Galleon period. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a very, very interesting story. And it was massive. It was absolutely massive because it involved Spain and what was known as New Spain, which was basically a big chunk of the western United States, starting at about Washington State downward, all the way to Lima, Peru, all the way to Peru. That whole area was basically under Spanish control during the 16th century. And the Spaniards had wanted very much to have a trade route out of New Spain instead of going around the traditional route around Africa and over to China. They wanted to have a new route, and they thought we could do it by going from the west coast of what's now known as Mexico, Acapulco, send ships to China and set up a trading post somewhere near China and be able to swap silver and commodities for silk and tea and all the other stuff. But primarily from the very beginning, it was mostly silk they were interested in. And and why and so forth, sort of an interesting thing. And it really got a jump start by the Chinese government itself, because during the Ming Dynasty around 1522, they enacted a thing called the Single Whip Law. And the Single Whip Law basically meant that all taxes had to be paid in silver. They couldn't accept goods in exchange for taxes. Paper money, which the Ming Dynasty had tried, had gone into great decline. Nobody trusted it because of inflation and chicanery with printing money. It still happens today. You just print the money. You don't have to actually produce a product. And people didn't trust it anymore. And the Chinese decided they needed to go to a solid commodity, which was silver. And at that time, silver was more valued in China than gold. This is the thing that a lot of people don't realize, is that silver was the thing. And at times it was worth more than gold in China. But in the West, of course, it was the other way around. So you had this massive arbitrage in value between what silver was worth in the West versus what you could get for silver in China. It gave them a great trading advantage, and the Chinese were only willing really to trade for silver at the time. And this simplification of the tax structure codified the demand for silver into law. And this was a problem for the Ming court because they were spending huge amount of money. And during the 1500s, they were spending a massive amount of their annual revenues on military stuff, trying to hold the empire together because the Ming Empire was starting to slide and go into decline. And the Chinese realized that they had to come up with a scheme to bring in silver, and exporting goods was a good way to do it. And the main supplier of this was going to be Spain, and I'll explain why in a minute. All right, but a little history first. The Philippines were claimed in the name of Spain in 1521 by Ferdinand Magellan, who was actually a Spaniard. I mean, he was actually a Portuguese explorer, rather, working for the Spanish at that time. And he named the Philippines after King Philip II of Spain, the Philippines. And that's where the name came from. And then around 1571, a Spanish general, Lopez de Legazpi, was sent over there, and he started out in one part of the Philippines, and eventually he established the city of Manila as the trading post. And this was where they were going to be doing all of their business. It was an ideal port to work out of. It was a well-protected harbor, had good land access and all that other stuff. And there were already Chinese there. There were Chinese people there, Chinese business people there, conducting business, doing trade. They'd been there for a long time, some of them for many generations. And then more of them came along. But the most important aspect of all of this was the Spaniards and their silver. All right, this was the thing that people, you forget how much silver was being produced during the Ming Empire, during the 1500s, 1550 to about 1800. Lima, Peru, the area around Lima, was producing roughly on any given year anywhere from 60 to 80% of the total global silver production in the world was coming out of this one area. There was so much of it, and it was a particularly fine quality. extremely fine quality, and it was easy to mine, and they were getting out of the ground very, very easily, and they found that they could trade it for all kinds of things at great advantage in China for Chinese good. And then around 1573 or 4, a process was discovered by a guy named Harry Cross, who introduced the idea of using mercury amalgamation process to mining silver. And it sounds like, what does that matter? Well, what it means is that they could take low-grade silver ore that previously wasn't worth very much and get the silver out of that, which in the end, because they had dug up they had so much low-grade ore that they dug up to get into the mines, they could now extract from the stuff that had been dug out, which radically increased the amount of silver production, and they could strike veins into new areas before that wouldn't have been profitable, which further again increased the amount of silver. And this was a very big thing. And the reason they were buying, it's interesting, the reason the Spaniards and the Europeans wanted to buy silk from China, even though they'd been producing their own for hundreds of years. There was lots of silk production in Spain, Italy, France, and Europe by this time. Absolutely was there. But the deal was that China was so far ahead in silk production that they could produce a better quality silk, much better quality. It was the most preferred silk in the world at the time, and they could produce it for less. And then the Spaniards looked at that, and they could buy it. They could make roughly, some of the estimates are 400% profit compared to European silk. So they were sending silver over, which was being valued at a much higher rate than it was in the West. So they were gaining there with the increased value of their silver when they made their buys in the Philippines of silk in particular, which was about 90% of all the trade from the beginning. Initially, it was silk before they got into tea and other things. And they were able to sell it for huge profits, and they weren't even buying it dyed. Most of the silk they were buying was just plain white silk, and they were dyeing it in New Spain and in Spain proper when the stuff got there. And the scheme was originally that they would ship silver out of Lima. It would go through Acapulco, and all of this was to get taxed and be regulated and controlled by King Philip. And then it would go to the Philippines. They would buy the silk, buy whatever else they wanted, ship it back, and then it would be transported overland, theoretically, to the Gulf of Mexico on the eastern side, reloaded onto Spanish ships, sent through Havana, Cuba, and then back onto Spain, and then it could be taxed and so forth. And then the stuff, once it was taxed and controlled, would be sent back to the New World, to the New Spain, and then sold. And what happened was, of course, was that there was a lot of smuggling going on. There was a lot of privateers operating, people that were skipping the tax system. People in Lima, Peru wanted the stuff sent directly to them. They were very wealthy. They wanted luxury goods. They didn't want to pay the taxes and so forth. And then to combat this, the King of Spain started putting limits on cargo tonnage coming out of Manila to cut down on the amount of smuggling that was going on, because they estimate that the smuggling was maybe 200% greater than the legitimate shipping that was going on at times. So they were limiting 300 tons per ship, but they found out the ships were actually carrying 13 or 1400 tons of goods on them, and they were being traded by crew members. People were sneaking things aboard, and it was a very inefficient system. But the King of Spain was sort of powerless to do too much about it because he was so far away, and the Chinese were getting worried about it because they were afraid that if this kind of stuff went on forever, the Spaniards might stop trading with them because so much was being lost due to smuggling and so forth. So it was a real sort of a three-way, I guess is how you describe it. And it was sort of interesting because at the beginning of all this trade, when they started to dip their toe into Manila and were trying to open up relations, they were doing some business and they were shipping and all this, but there was a little bit of a distance between. It was a trust issue, I guess, between Spain and the Chinese emperor. And one of the things that helped get rid of those concerns was that during, this was around 1570 or so, there was Legazpi, the Spanish general that was in Manila, he had ships go out and rescue a Chinese junk off the coast of Maduro that had some Chinese traders on it, and they rescued the sailors who were shipwrecked. They rescued their cargo. They got them on board. They treated them extremely well, very respectfully, and so forth. And the word of this great kindness got back to the emperor, that these Spaniards went out of their way to rescue a common trading junk and to save the crew and treated them well, didn't rob them, and to the emperor this meant that the Spaniards could be trusted. And this started, I think it was 1572 this happened. And there was an interesting story because there was a Padre Zuniga who was there at the time, and he wrote, basically, he kept a diary, and one of the things he wrote was, at the beginning of 1572, there arrived with a great deal of rich merchandise those Chinese whom the Spaniards had saved from a shipwreck on Maduro, together with many others of that nation. With this, the foundation of a lucrative commerce was laid. In other words, they saved the sailors. They brought their goods that they were trying to sell to Manila. They did the business with them. It all worked out in the end, and the Chinese took this as to be a great sign of their integrity in trade. And this was a very interesting thing. And those things then, of course, were shipped out of there, went to Acapulco on galleons. And they actually contained 712 crates of silk alone and other goods. And this was really the kickoff. And then the silver trade was getting pretty well established. And then a couple of years later, something else happened. And the Chinese sort of tested the resolve of the Spaniards to be their friend. In 1574, the Ming Navy was commanded out of the Fujian military headquarters, was fighting a branch of Chinese pirates who had fled to Luzon. They had left China. They were being chased out. They went to Luzon, and they contacted the Spaniards and said, will you help us get rid of these guys? Luzon is in the Philippines, and we need your assistance to keep the seaways safe and open for trade, and we need to get rid of these guys. And the Spaniards said we'd be happy to, because they wanted free trade. They understood what the deal was here. The deal was to do business, and the Spaniards went out and got rid of it. And after that, the merchants became more active in trade directly on the Fujian coast. They were allowed to come up there and send orders in and so forth, and have it, as long as it passed through Manila, they were all set. And these two events, within a couple of years of one another, went a long way to build the foundation of cooperation between Spain and China. All right. And at that time, as I said, about between 1572 and 1588, 95% of all the goods imported to Manila from China were silk products. That was it. That's all they were interested in. And then eventually, a lot of silver was pouring in. They began to buy other products, porcelain, teas and spices and whatnot. But it all started with silk. And this went on for, like I said, it went on up until 1815, and it produced vast amounts of wealth for the Chinese government. But they were spending it as fast as it came in, because the Ming Dynasty were fighting, for their survival due to economic problem. And even though they were getting as much as they could buy, it was never enough. And the Galleons went back and forth continuously for the next 250 years. And what happened was, at the end of the Ming Dynasty, when the Ming Dynasty finally collapsed in 1644, the trade continued. There was still some goods being sent out. Not much of it was being regulated, of course, because of the turmoil and things that were going on. So the Spaniards were doing very well with it, but the Chinese weren't. And along came the Emperor Kangxi, and everybody was a little worried about him because he was the Mandarin. They'd had the battles to take over the country, and immediately he sent out word that he wanted trade to resume. He wanted full trade with the West. He wanted the Spaniards to feel free to come in and do business, because now they were no longer fighting battles. the Kangxi Emperor had basically secured China during his lifetime. He instituted a new form of government, appointed former Han officials to be officials for him. Things were going on great. So now, when the money came in, they didn't have to spend it all on the military. They could spend it on infrastructure. They could spend it on building empire. They could spend it on accumulating wealth, massive amounts of wealth. And this is why by the middle of the 18th century, with all of this trading going on, in particular from Spain, the Qinlong court, the Yongchen court, the Qinlong court was awash in money, awash in silver. They had other trade going on too, for sure. But the big money, as they say, was coming out of Spain through the Lima silver mines, which was what the Chinese really wanted. And they kept this going as long as they could until the British came along and began swapping opium for silver to undo. They had a trade imbalance they were doing lots of business through the British East India Company, of course, by the end of the 18th century, and they were trying to get back some of their trade deficit to reduce it. And there's the famous letter, of McCartney going to see Emperor Qinlong in the 1790s, begging him to open up additional ports, because the Chinese were very leery of the Europeans by this point, especially the English. They had cut down the number of ports they could trade to and limited it just to Guangzhou or Canton. And there was some changing dynamics there because the Chinese were afraid of foreign intervention because they were beginning to overstep too much. But it was a very, very big thing for the Chinese to try and control their ports, because they just didn't trust the foreigners anymore. And by this time, by the late 18th century, the Spaniards' involvement was beginning to dwindle as it became more focused on trade from England to the Dutch and France and so forth. But the galleons kept going back and forth and putting goods into Central America and South America. There was all this accumulated money. A lot of the wealth of Spain was in this part of the world now, in the New World technically, and they wanted to have these luxury goods sent over to them and so forth. And eventually it started to subside as Spaniards' involvement there decreased. There was less and less silver being sent. The focus became, like I said, towards Europe, and that was sort of the winding down of it. The government in Madrid preferred that the colonies always trade with Spain directly throughout this whole period. And the problem was that they could never really get them to do it because they never had the control over that massive swath of land, as I said, from the upper half of the eastern United States all the way to the end of South America. That was an absolutely massive amount of land, and they couldn't really control it very well. And as a result, these trade deals were under constant negotiations between the Chinese and the Spaniards. They were always trying to jigger it along and try to get it to work a little better, and it never really came together the way they had envisioned. And before you know it, the Spaniards were out, the British were in, and we ended up with the Opium Wars and all the problems that went along with it. But it's important to always know that much of the silver and much of the wealth that we often think came as a result of trading with the Europeans, with England rather, and the Dutch and all this, it really came from Spain. And it really came from sort of an unlikely place, Lima, Peru, who knew, and shipped out through Acapulco. And that is where a giant chunk of China's wealth came from between the end of the Ming Dynasty and the middle of the Qing Dynasty, before the nation went into another decline during the 19th century with the disastrous effects of the opium trade, which ended up addicting about 10% of China's total population. And all in, again, an attempt to get silver now out of the country, and in exchange for a narcotic. And it was a disastrous result. But for 250 years, roughly, the Spaniards had a very good, clean, open relationship with China, though they had their problems with smugglers and one thing and another. So it's a very interesting history, and I'll put some PDF links below this video that you can go to download to read up on it. It's an area that has been written about. There's lots of Chinese porcelain that's turned up in Mexico and churches and so forth. In particular, Swato wares out of Zhengzhou was a major trading port, and there are places throughout the eastern United States, up and down as far north as Oregon, where they have found Chinese blue and white plates from the Ming Dynasty. And it's all very, very interesting, and I hope you'd look into it. All right, that's it for this one. Subscribe if you haven't. We'll see you tomorrow with the regular weekly video, and thanks so much for watching. All right. Bye-bye.